He handed me a document before my father's body was even cold. My stepmother's son, the one she'd brought into our lives 7 years ago, like a piece of furniture she refused to leave behind, stood in the doorway of my father's study with a manila envelope and the kind of smile people wear when they've already spent money. They haven't received yet. He dropped it on the desk in front of me without a word, turned around, and walked back down the hall. I looked at the envelope. My name was written on the front in handwriting that wasn't my father's. I opened it anyway. Inside was a single page. An amendment to my father's revocable living trust, dated 11 days before he died. According to this document, my father had revised his estate plan to leave the Mercer Street property, our family home, the house where I had grown up, the house where he had built his accounting practice in the converted garage for 31 years entirely to my stepmother. No split, no buyout provision, no share for me, just a signature at the bottom that looked almost like his. Almost. The loop on the G in Gerald was wrong. My father signed his G with a clean, confident loop, the same way every single time. He had shown me once when I was 9, sitting at this very desk, teaching me that a signature was a promise. This G was cramped, hesitant, written by someone copying from memory. I set the page down on the desk. I looked out the window at the backyard, at the garden my father had maintained every spring for 20 years, at the ceramic pots my mother had painted before she died when I was 6. I did not cry. I had cried for 3 days straight in the hospital room while my father slipped away from pancreatic cancer, and I had nothing left. What I felt now was something quieter and much more dangerous. I picked up the envelope, folded it twice, and put it in my jacket pocket. My stepmother was in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She was wearing her good pearls, the freshwater ones my father had given her on their 5th anniversary, and she was on the phone. She looked up when she heard me on the stairs. Something moved across her face. Not guilt, more like calculation, like she was measuring how much I already knew. I smiled at her. She blinked. That was not the reaction she had prepared for. I told her I was going out to get some air and that I would be back for dinner. She covered the phone with her hand and reminded me that her attorney was coming by tomorrow morning to go over the estate paperwork. I said that sounded fine. I drove straight to the office of Thomas Pendleton. Mr. Pendleton had been my father's estate attorney for 18 years. He was the kind of man who wore the same 3 suits in rotation and kept a bowl of hard candies on his desk that nobody ever touched. He had drawn up my father's original trust when I was 11, and he had updated it twice since then. He knew my father's signature better than most people knew their own children's handwriting. He was still in the office when I arrived, even though it was nearly 7 in the evening. His assistant let me in without an appointment. I sat down across from his desk and slid the amendment across to him. He put on his glasses. He read it. He read it again. He set it down on the desk with the careful deliberateness of a man controlling a very strong reaction. He asked me where I had gotten this. I told him my stepmother's son had delivered it to me this afternoon. Mr. Pendleton was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a thick green folder. He set it on the desk and tapped it once with 2 fingers. Your father was in this office 14 days ago, he said. He was weaker than the last time I had seen him. He needed help getting to the chair, but his mind was clear, and his hands were steady. He signed a final amendment to the trust in my presence, with 2 witnesses and a notary. He was very specific about what he wanted. He slid the folder across to me. I opened it. I found the amendment. I read the highlighted section. My father had left the Mercer Street property and the accounting firm's assets to me outright, along with a life rights provision allowing my stepmother to remain in the house rent-free for as long as she chose, with one condition. She could not sell, mortgage, refinance, or transfer any portion of the property. Any attempt to do so would immediately void the life rights provision and revert full possession to me. I read it twice. He knew, I said. He knew she would try this. Mr. Pendleton looked at me over the top of his glasses. He had known Gerald Mercer for 18 years. He did not need to say anything else. I asked him whether the document my stepmother's son had given me was legally valid. He looked at it again for a moment. Then he said, in my professional opinion, no. The notary's stamp on this amendment is from a county 2 states away. The date falls within the window your father was on continuous IV sedation at the hospice. And that signature, he did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I leaned back in the chair. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the building's old HVAC system and a hard candy clicking against the inside of the bowl on the desk. I could take this to the police right now, I said. I could file an injunction tomorrow morning and have her out of the house within the week. Mr. Pendleton nodded slowly. You could, he said. And she would hire a lawyer who would argue the amendment was genuine. She would claim your father signed it during a moment of clarity between sedation cycles. It would go to probate. That process takes 18 months minimum, sometimes 3 years. During that time, she lives in the house. The accounting firm's assets sit frozen, and the legal fees eat into the estate from both sides. I looked at him. So, what you're saying is that stopping her isn't enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what I'm saying is that your father came to me 14 days ago because he specifically did not want this to drag through probate. He was very clear about that. I thought about my father sitting in this chair 2 weeks ago, too weak to stand without help, still thinking about what would happen to me after he was gone. I thought about the amendment in the green folder with his real signature, the G with the clean, confident loop. I looked up at Mr. Pendleton. I don't want to stop the sale, I said. He raised his eyebrows. She's going to try to sell the house. She has someone waiting. I could see it on her face this afternoon. She has already made arrangements, so let's let her make them. Mr. Pendleton was very still for a moment. Then something changed in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more considered than that. He opened a fresh legal pad and uncapped his pen. Tell me what you're thinking, he said. I went back to the house that night. My stepmother was watching television in the living room and her son was eating at the kitchen table. Neither of them said much to me. I said goodnight and went upstairs to my old bedroom. I waited until the house was quiet. Then I went to work. My father had been meticulous about documentation. 31 years of running a small accounting practice will do that to a person. Every file, every folder, every receipt going back 2 decades was organized in the converted garage office according to a system he had taught me when I was 16. I knew where everything was. More importantly, I knew about the backup drive. 3 years ago, when my father first got sick, I had installed a home security system and a set of interior cameras for him, hidden inside the smoke detectors and the bookshelves. I told him it was so I could check in on him remotely when I wasn't there. That was true. But I had also set up continuous cloud recording, and I had never given anyone else the login credentials. I sat down at the desk in the garage office, opened my laptop, and logged into the cloud archive. I scrolled back 6 weeks. I found what I was looking for in 11 minutes. The kitchen camera, time-stamped at 10:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before my father died. My stepmother was at the kitchen table. Her son was beside her. A man I didn't recognize was sitting across from them with a laptop open and what looked like a notary kit laid out on the table. I could see the tube of a rubber stamp, a seal embosser, an ink pad. I put on my headphones. Her son was talking. He was saying the signature needed to look more tired, more unsteady, like he was doing it with a tremor. My stepmother said she had practiced it. She said it looked exactly right. The man with the laptop asked if the notary seal would hold up to scrutiny. He had a flat, transactional voice. Her son said it didn't need to. It just needed to hold up long enough to get through a probate filing before anyone looked too closely. By the time a forensic examiner gets near it, he said, the house will already be sold, the money will already be moved, and we'll be dealing with a civil dispute from a beach in Costa Rica. My stepmother laughed. It was a bright, casual laugh, like they were talking about vacation plans, which I suppose, in a way, they were. I paused the video. My hands were not shaking. I was past that. What I felt was a cold, focused clarity, the kind that only comes when you stop being surprised and start making decisions. I made a copy of the file, encrypted it, and saved it in 3 places. Then I kept watching. The next morning at 9 o'clock, her son called a real estate agent. I know because I was sitting in the kitchen eating toast when he went upstairs to make the call, and because the library camera picked up every word. He was listing the property. He wanted a cash buyer. He wanted a fast close, someone who would not ask too many questions about the title history. He mentioned a number, 1.4 million. The Mercer Street property was worth at least 1.8, and everyone in the neighborhood knew it. He was in a hurry. Desperate men always underprice. I finished my toast. I went back to the garage office and called Mr. Pendleton. We talked for 40 minutes. By the time I hung up, the outline of the plan was clear. We needed a buyer. Not a real one. I was not going to let an unsuspecting family get tangled in a fraudulent title. We needed an entity. Something corporate and vague enough to seem credible. Something with a reason to move fast. Mr. Pendleton had a solution. He maintained a small shell LLC for privacy purposes in high net worth transactions, Ashfield Property Group. It had a professional email address, a registered agent, and a history of legitimate use. We drafted the offer that afternoon. Subject: Cash offer Mercer Street property. Offer $1.55 million. All cash. 7-day close. The reason for the speed. Ashfield was completing a Section 1031 exchange, a tax deferral mechanism that requires reinvestment within a strict 45-day window. The clock was running. The urgency was real on paper, and it explained why a buyer would move this fast without asking many questions about the seller's documentation. We sent the email to the address listed on the hastily posted for sale listing her son had published that morning. I was in the garage office when the reply came in. 6 hours later, I had the audio feed from the living room running in one earbud. Her son's voice, "Mom, look at this." A pause. "My stepmother, 1.55? That's less than asking." Her son, "We're not in a position to negotiate. We need this closed in 2 weeks, max, before the probate filing gets contested. Take the number." My stepmother, "Can we counter?" Her son, after a pause, "Yes, but keep it small. We don't want to spook them." They countered at 1.65 million. Mr. Pendleton looked at me when the counter came through. He said, "She's trying to squeeze an extra 100,000 out of a fraudulent sale." I said, "Let her have it. Send 1.62. Final offer. Make her feel like she won something." 3 hours later. Accepted. Please send the purchase agreement. I looked out the garage window at the ceramic pots in the backyard. My father had replanted them every spring without fail. They were still sitting there in the November cold, waiting. "Schedule the closing for Friday," I told Mr. Pendleton. "I want to be there." The closing was at a title company downtown. Mr. Pendleton arranged for it to be handled through an associate firm, professional, neutral, unremarkable. The kind of office that smells like carpet cleaner and printer toner. The kind of place where big decisions get signed away quietly. I was not in the room when they arrived. I was in a parked car across the street, watching a live feed from a small camera discreetly positioned on the lapel of Mr. Pendleton's associate, a younger attorney named Rachel, who had been briefed on everything and who had a very good poker face. At 10:02 a.m., a rideshare pulled up. My stepmother got out first. She was dressed well, better than I had seen her dress in months, a charcoal wool coat and the freshwater pearls. Her son was beside her in a suit that looked like it had been pressed that morning. They walked in like people who were about to close the most important deal of their lives. I zoomed in on the feed. Her son was carrying a leather portfolio. My stepmother's hands were clasped in front of her like she was walking into church. They sat down across the table from Rachel. Rachel thanked them for accommodating the timeline. She explained that her client was under pressure to finalize the exchange before the IRS window closed. She slid the purchase agreement across the table. Her son looked at the documents. He adjusted his tie. He asked a few questions about the wire transfer process. Rachel answered each one calmly and thoroughly. Then Rachel said, "Before we proceed to signature, I'll need to verify the seller's authority to transfer title. Do you have the trust amendment authorizing the sale?" Her son opened the leather portfolio. He removed the document, the forged amendment, the one with the cramped G and the out-of-state notary stamp, and laid it on the table with the composure of someone who had rehearsed this moment several times. My stepmother smoothed the front of her coat. Rachel reviewed the amendment for a long moment. She did not look up. "Okay," she said. "Let's proceed." Her son picked up the pen. He signed the purchase agreement. My stepmother signed beneath him. They initialed each page. When it was done, her son sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly through his nose. The exhale of a man who believes he has just gotten away with something. That was when the conference room door opened. I had been walking across the street for the past 4 minutes. I came in through the lobby, took the elevator to the 3rd floor, and walked down the hall. The receptionist had been expecting me. I opened the door. My stepmother looked up. The color left her face in a single, visible wave, like a tide going out. Her son went absolutely still. I set my bag on the table and sat down. "What is this?" her son said. His voice was controlled, but his jaw was tight. I looked at him. Then I looked at my stepmother. "You know," I said, "the house looks wonderful this time of year. My father used to say November was the only month the light came through the kitchen windows at the right angle. I always thought he was being sentimental, but he was right. It is a beautiful house. I'm going to enjoy living there." Her son started to stand up. "This is not your business anymore. We have a signed purchase agreement." "You have a problem," I said. I nodded to Mr. Pendleton, who had just come in behind me. He set a document on the table. My father's real trust amendment. The one with 2 witnesses, a notary, and a G, signed with a clean, confident loop. Mr. Pendleton began to speak. He explained the life rights provision. He explained the condition. He explained that the moment my stepmother signed a purchase agreement for the Mercer Street property, she had legally voided the life rights my father had given her. 1 minute ago, she had a place to live for as long as she wanted. The moment she signed, she had forfeited it entirely. The property reverted to me, effective immediately. Her son looked at the document. Then he looked at the forged amendment still sitting on the table. The thing about desperation is that it makes people sloppy. He had known about the real amendment the whole time, which meant he had known there was a valid trust in place, which meant he had chosen to forge a replacement rather than contest the original. That decision had consequences. The door opened again. A man in a gray jacket stepped in. He introduced himself by name and showed a badge. He was not there to negotiate. He said the wire transfer that had just been processed $1.62 million, initiated 4 minutes ago, had been flagged. He said the title being transferred was encumbered. He said transferring title to a property under a living trust, using a document that a forensic examiner had already reviewed and determined to be fraudulent, while accepting a wire transfer for the proceeds, constituted federal wire fraud. My stepmother made a sound I had never heard her make before. Her son pushed back from the table. He said this was a misunderstanding. He said the amendment was genuine. He said he had witnesses. The detective said that was fine. They would be happy to speak with those witnesses. He then mentioned the recording, the kitchen. 10:47 p.m. 3 weeks before Gerald Mercer died. The rubber stamp on the table. The conversation about holding up long enough for the money to move. My stepmother sat down. She did not speak again for a long time. Her son looked at me. There was a long, terrible silence. He said, "After everything your father did for you, you're going to let them do this to us?" I looked at him for a moment. "My father," I said, "spent 31 years building something honest. He drove 45 minutes each way to meet with clients who couldn't afford to come to him. He kept paper records because he said a handshake meant nothing if you couldn't back it up. He did all of that so that I would have something after he was gone. And you sat at his kitchen table 3 weeks before he died and practiced forging his name." I stood up. "He is not your father," I said. "He was mine." My stepmother's son was handcuffed at the table. My stepmother was taken into custody in the lobby downstairs, where her freshwater pearls caught the fluorescent light as she walked past the reception desk, and I watched her go. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that. Standing in the lobby of a downtown title company, watching the woman who had shared my father's last years get walked out in handcuffs is not something I would describe as victory. It was heavy. It was the weight of everything that had led to that moment. 6 years of watching her reshape my father's life around her comfort, of watching her son treat the house like an entitlement, of watching my father work harder than ever in his final years to make sure I would be protected, and seeing all of it nearly disappear in a single forged signature. But it was also something else. It was the end of something I had been bracing against for a very long time. I drove back to Mercer Street alone. The house was empty in the way that only houses recently vacated can be, the particular silence of rooms that have held people and suddenly don't. I walked through the front hall, past the side table where my father kept his keys and his reading glasses, into the kitchen where the ceramic pots were visible through the window, standing in the cold backyard like small, patient sentinels. I went to my father's study. On the desk, beneath a stack of files he had been reviewing from his hospice bed right up until the last week, was a small wooden box. I had seen it there my entire life. It was nothing special to look at oak, hand-jointed, the kind of thing sold at craft fairs, but my father had kept it on his desk for as long as I could remember. Inside was a Longines watch that had belonged to his father before him. He had promised it to me when I was 14, the year I asked him why he never wore it. "Because it's not for wearing," he said. "It's for keeping. Someday it's yours to keep." My stepmother had taken the watch out of the box the week he went into hospice. I had seen it on her son's wrist at the viewing. I opened the box. It was empty. I sat down in my father's chair. Then in the top drawer, under a rubber band and a folded note in my father's handwriting that just said, "Call Tom P. Ree. Amendment," I found the watch, wrapped in a small cloth. Left there, I think, because he knew someone would come looking for it on the desk, and he wanted to make sure it was somewhere only I would think to look. I held it for a long time. My father had spent his whole life teaching me that a signature was a promise. That paper mattered. That the difference between what was right and what was legal was sometimes a very thin line, and that the only way to walk that line was to keep your records clean and your word clean, and to trust that the truth, if you protected it carefully enough, would eventually prove itself. He had done that. Even from a hospice bed, Even at the end, he had done that. I put the watch on. It was a little loose on my wrist. I'd need to have it adjusted. But it sat there, solid and quiet and exactly where it was supposed to be. And I looked down at it in the late afternoon light coming through the window at just the angle my father had always said it would. Sometimes justice doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with raised voices or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a conference room, when a greedy person picks up a pen and signs the one document that ends everything they thought they had already won. My father knew that. He planned for it. He was always 3 steps ahead,